Thank you so much to Rabbi Moshe for having me here. To Yael, Melissa, and otherwise. So the title is Voting a Mitzvah? And I realize an irony that the name of the program today is The Mitzvah of Voting. It would be really ironic if I concluded, and awkward actually, if I said voting is not actually a mitzvah. Oops, the problem. One of those shiurim where you know what the goal is, right? Like obviously I'm going to advocate for, I hope you realize that, I'm going to advocate that voting is a good thing. But the question, there really is a question, is it a mitzvah per se? And by the way, it reminded me of a time in my shul at Orah where something similar happened. We had a women's Megillah reading for Purim, and it happened to be Saturday night, and at Shal Shudas I gave a class. Are women's Megillah readings legitimate? You know, are okay, right? And then in the announcements it said, are women's Megillah readings, and then are they okay? That's my class. And the next thing in the announcements was, women's Megillah reading will take place at, right, at 8 p.m. So like that's where you know what the answer is. But anyway, so that's what's going on here. So I'm going to argue that definitely voting is something religiously, even obligatory, but we have to really define precisely what a mitzvah is. Is it a mitzvah the way that, let's say, davening every day, or let's say, the way putting on tefillin is a mitzvah? Was it one of the 613 mitzvot? If you look at a list of the 613 mitzvot, you won't find that. There tends to be a distinction between what we would say colloquially in like Yiddish, let's say, as a mitzvah. You help an old lady across the street, you've done a good deed. But mitzvah in the original context really means an obligation, a commandment. Sivoy means something that is commanded. So in that sense, it's not really clear. I'm going to argue it's obviously clear that it's a religiously positive thing, and even strongly encouraged to vote. But is it an obligation, a commandment? That's something that we'll actually explore. So remember, the term mitzvah has two connotations. In the sense of a good deed, something you're supposed to do, it absolutely is a mitzvah. There's an interesting story, perhaps apocryphal, that I heard in the name of the Gerer Rebbe, who's a Hasidic Rebbe who lives in Israel. His predecessor, I guess his father, I heard this in the name of, they tend to be one of the more Zionist, pro-Israel Hasidic groups. And actually all the groups, even the ones who are not pro-Israel, tend to encourage their followers to vote. And they actually do put up what's called Hashvilin. They put up these flyers around town in Jerusalem and in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods saying that it is a mitzvah to vote. It's absolutely obligatory that you have to vote. So let me ask you a question. When these Hasidic groups, sometimes not even Zionists, are saying that it's an obligation to vote in Israel, what's the basis, do you think, of that obligation in their mind? Anyone have any idea?
To secure power for themselves.
What?
To secure power for themselves.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's the answer. Meaning, because it's obligatory to do what's in your interests. Very pragmatic, right? Meaning, they're not saying that because we're Israelis and we're proud Zionists that we want to take part in Israeli society. Some of them are saying that. Remember, the Ger Hasidic group, maybe there are some actual ultra-Orthodox groups that are more kind of pro-Israel than others. But the majority, it's kind of this cold, pragmatic concern. So, what my agenda here today is not to argue that Jews ought to vote because the Torah believes in seeking our own interests. Let's say Israel, whatever our interests are, or economically. We're going to take that for granted. I don't have to put on a source sheet that thou shalt do what is in the community's interest and what's good for the Jews, so to speak. What we really want to discover when we ask the question, is voting a mitzvah, we mean as a matter of principle, not just a matter of pragmatism. That's the easy, alliterative way. You remember it. We're talking about a pragmatic basis for voting or a principle basis for voting. And I want to argue that there is a Jewish principle basis for voting, which, what would the principle be? Anyone? Any feedback? What would a principle basis of voting be? Not just Jew, not just a source, but like why is it, you tell me, why is it worthwhile to vote? Why ought a person vote?
Well,
Yes.
just in more religious context, like you're trying to decide, like your community is trying to decide, like who your rabbi might be. So you have to figure that out. You have to vote on that, and it can really determine the direction of the shul, like the whole hashkafa, like responsibilities.
Right. So applying that to the country, it could determine the direction of the country.
Yeah.
So that's more altruistic. You're saying not because of what it will do for our community, but what it will do for everyone.
Or not? No, I mean like
Yeah.
literally like your shul. But also
Oh, okay. So that's a little more pragmatic. So you're actually espousing the
pragmatic. Altruistic, it's like where are we going?
So where are we going? Exactly. So that's what I want to argue. Like you're the second part of your sentence assumes that we are Americans and we have a responsibility toward other Americans.
Right, just we. That's the.
Exactly right. So that's what I want to argue more. Yeah.
So I would say Michael Waltzman, his new book, Judaism and Politics and God Shadow, sovereign of the Jewish people, or the people, kings, institutions of the state are. And I would say that if, barring the fact that we have institutions of the state where we live in Israel or in the religious polity as such, that there is, part of that answer is that we have self-determination. Like, part of what Jewish people are is to actually create a governing society.
So it's like a matter of principle for people to take their fate into their own hands and self-determine. All right, so exactly. So we'll get to all these ideas and these sources, and I have them in very accessible, all in English, just straight Bible verses. Good old, that we talk about evangelicals, right? This is the source sheet that I wanted to make accessible to evangelical Christians, if they accept. I wrote Devarim instead of Deuteronomy. There is one from the Bible, from the Talmud, but all right, it's mostly going to be very easy, just reading verses and kind of orally discussing the oral Torah on it. But I would say first that, to me, when I think of the principle of what moves me to vote, as opposed to the pragmatic reason, is because I feel like an American, that's part of my identity, and participating in voting and in what's best for society, you're making that statement that I'm a productive member of society, I care what happens to society. That to me is the principle of it, and I want to show that there's a Jewish case to be made for that. What you might call a more modern Orthodox case, that we're Jews and we're also Americans, and being American is part of our identity also, and that places responsibility on us. So we have from Deuteronomy, and I headed this little section as democracy, because the first question we should ask is, well, how do you know Judaism even believes that democratic system is legitimate in the first place? At first glance, we always had a monarchy throughout Tanakh and throughout the Bible. And don't we believe in monarchy? And maybe we don't think the entire enterprise of giving one person one vote is even legitimate. We don't believe in it. We don't think we take part in it. So there, we would ironically see from Devarim that monarchy is actually the only form of government that the Torah seems to criticize and yet acquiesces to. So what does it say? When you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you, it's right, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Verse 15, you shall surely appoint over a king whom Hashem your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. It's interesting if you connect that to American law that the president has to be born in America, right? So this is perhaps one of the Judeo-Christian influences. Well, not really. It seems to be just a kind of universal idea, right? It has to be a Jew who's the king of Israel. It has to be someone who's born in America. And of course, you have the birthers who claim that President Obama was born in Kenya and therefore is ineligible, which obviously no one seriously argues. No one serious argues, but it actually came up also that John McCain was born in Panama, but on an American military base. Interestingly enough, so it was American territory, but there was a debate whether it's really American. Anyway, so what is this saying, basically? You have a king, but why? What's the first verse saying about what's the impetus for having a king? The people, what?
To be like the other nations.
Right, exactly. The commentary sees on this is very interesting. It seems to be, this is an example of the Torah acquiescing to something which is not ideal, but which the people initiated, ironically. Sometimes, this is an example where democracy leads to non-democratic system. We could go far afield and on a tangent and talk about the Arab Spring and what might be happening there in terms of, right, when you give the people themselves wanted a monarchy and not a democracy. But anyway, because the people said we want a king to be like all the other nations, meaning at the time monarchy was fashionable, and the Jewish people wanted the dignity and the honor of having a glorious, powerful king, right? So God says, okay, because you asked for it, I'll give you one. And if you look at the first king who was inaugurated, Shaul, in the book of Shmuel, happens to be the Haftorah of Parshat Korach, which is a Haftorah which deals with issues of authority, right? So that's, if you want to look it up, in the back of the Chumash, in the Haftorah of Korach, Shmuel the prophet criticizes the people and basically chastises themselves for asking for a king. So, you're just trying to be like the Gentiles around you. Why did you request a king? So definitely we see that monarchy is not held up as an ideal. It's actually the opposite. The Torah is criticizing the Jews for asking for it. That doesn't mean, however, that the Torah is pushing democracy. It's just saying monarchy is bad. There are alternatives. There are other forms of government. You could have government that's not elected, but is still supposed to be representative of the people, work for the people. Right? I believe a republic refers to that, where it's supposed to be working toward the interests of the people, but the people don't necessarily elect who leads them. But what we do see from the source, which is important, is that we can quote the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who lived in the late 1800s, who his interpretation of this verse is fascinating. He said the commandment to appoint a king only kicks in. What does it say in the first verse? The Amarta, Asim Alai Melech. And it will be that when you come to the land and you say, let us set a king over us. Only if the Jewish people initiate it does it become obligatory to have a king. If the Jewish people don't, the Amarta, if there's no you people saying that you want a king, the Netziv is of the opinion that you could choose whatever government you want. It goes back to the people, because the Torah doesn't say what kind of government you'd have otherwise. And he bases it on Gemaras and commentaries who say that monarchy was not ideal. So basically, through the oral Torah, we see that the Torah allows leeway in what kind of government you want to choose, both for Jews and non-Jews. Which definitely means, for our purposes, we don't need to argue that the Torah advocates that democracy is obligatory. We only need to prove that it's tolerated, or that we recognize it, right? And that's for sure the case. If you look in the oral law, we definitely recognize the legitimacy of whatever a country wants to choose as a form of government. There's definitely no bar. We're not opposed to it. That's the only bar we have to prove. But if you look in source number 2, Talmud in Brachot 55a is a source that is brought by Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who is one of the former chief rabbis of Israel, a real gadol, a real giant of religious Zionism and modern Orthodoxy, who is very interesting. You had the chief rabbis of Israel who worked for the state and were religious Zionists and really were pro the whole democratic Zionist enterprise in the state of Israel, and they struggled. They were the first thinkers to struggle with, trying to apply biblical or Orthodox ideas to a modern liberal state, and they did a very admirable job of harmonizing the two. And you have a lot of a rich source load of writings from people like Rabbi Goren, Rav Kook, talking about the legitimacy of a democratic system from a Torah point of view, and the legitimacy of the state of Israel in that light. And you have Rabbi Goren pointing to this Gemara in Brachot, which seems to extol the virtues of democracy. Rabbi Yitzchak said, this is source number 2, we do not appoint a leader over a community without their consent. It's pretty unbelievable. The Talmud was written many centuries ago. As it says, it was written down, Shemot 35:30, and Moshe said to the children of Israel, see, the Lord has called by name B'Tzalel. In terms of who's going to build the ark, that makes him a leader of sorts. This guy B'Tzalel, the Mishkan, the tabernacle. B'Tzalel is going to be the chief builder, and Moshe comes. So what part of this verse indicates that they needed the people's consent? The fact that Moshe says "si," re'u, which in Hebrew is second person plural, meaning before he appoints B'Tzalel, he tells them, look, implying, is this okay? This is a very Talmudic fine analysis of words. He says, re'u, is this okay with you? Do you see? You have to understand also rabbinic language. When you say something, for example, ro'eh ani et divrechem, I agree with you. The word ro'eh can imply agreement, meaning I agree with you, the words you just said. Ro'eh ani et divrechem. I see your words. Another way of saying I agree with them. So here we have re'u, right? It's a very analytic analysis of words that the rabbis had. The Lord is called by name B'Tzalel. The Holy One, blessed be He, said to Moshe, do you consider B'Tzalel suitable? He replied, Sovereign of the universe, if you consider him suitable, surely I must also. And God said to him, still, go and consult them, the community. And he, Moshe, went and asked Israel, do you consider B'Tzalel suitable? And they replied, if the Holy One, blessed be He, and you consider him suitable, surely we must as well. The point is, the Talmud is extolling the idea of governing through the consent of the governed. And if we combine that with the interpretation of monarchy as not ideal, we definitely have an approval, at least, of the democratic system. We still don't have so that's step 1. We have approval. We don't necessarily have,
But even when there's a monarchy, there's still some sort of checks and balances, if you will. Like, it's not only that there's the king, there's also
right,
the
exactly.
high priest, and there are the Kohanim. It's not just a one-man show.
Exactly, right.
So
we have to define what we mean when we say democracy, and that's why I brought up the Arab Spring also. Voting is like the least important aspect of what we mean when we say democracy. Like majority, 51% versus 49%. We really mean the rule of law, separation of powers, checks on power. That's all not only found in the Torah, but some would argue is sourced in, right? And, talk about the Judeo-Christian influence on the founding fathers. I'm not an expert in this, but I've read they're partially influenced by the Bible and how the king is subject to the Constitution. And I didn't copy it here because this is I want to keep it focused specifically on voting, but I could give like a whole other class that I'd be very excited about democracy in the Torah in general. The king in this very chapter in Devarim 17 has to keep a copy of the Torah with him at all times. What that shows is that the ruler is subject to the national constitution is the Torah. It's the same exact idea of the president. What was it?
Yeah, it's like Hobbes.
It's like
it's predating Hobbes by
that's unbelievable.
centuries.
Yeah, you have all that already in the Torah, and he had to carry it with him. I mean, imagine if the president had to actually carry a constitution in his pocket all the time to remind him, oh wait a minute, am I going according to this thing or not? And that was revolutionary in the ancient world, for the king to be subject to the law. So there's the rule of law. The Torah has the idea that the native and the stranger are equal in the law. It's another aspect of democracy. Also the fact that the king is not the religious leader. There's a Kohen Gadol, who's the religious leader. Separation of church and state. Interestingly, church is also part of the establishment. They're separate, but both kind of part of the establishment, but more like what you have in Europe. Then you have the high priest. And then you have the king, who's only in charge of secular affairs, like collecting taxes and going to war, as the rabbis say. He can't wrap himself in the mantle of religious authority. All those things definitely support what we call democracy. We're talking about specifically majority rule. If you have majority rule without those other aspects of democracy, you don't really have freedom. That's why I mentioned it'll be interesting to see what happens, let's say, in these Arab countries. What if 51% of the people elect an Islamist dictatorship against the wishes of the other 49%? There you have voting, right? But is it really democracy? But that's totally tangential and something to think about. I think we don't know yet. It's still very young, but it's like scary to think about. But we're talking about taking part in voting, let's say. Anyway, another thing you could throw out, and this is under the second heading of dual loyalty. Right? We just heard a lot about Israel. People talk about our loyalty to Israel versus the countries in which we live as Jews. And these two sources are not necessarily what you'd think. You'll see there, in terms of how I'm connecting it. It might appear obscure at first. So I've shown, let's say, that Judaism approves of democracy. But maybe that's for Jews within Israel and for Gentiles within their own countries. But maybe you could still argue that Jews, wherever we live, are separate from the country in which we live in. Right? We're not really part of America. We're just strangers here. I'm devil's advocate now. Right? We're a minority group, and we're always looking to go back to Israel, and that's where our loyalty lies. And so maybe we extol the right of American society to vote, but we're not part of that. Right? Let's say you want to make an argument like that. And these two verses in Vayikra 16, talking about Yom Kippur, and this is something that's like I just brought straight out of the Torah, because right under our nose we don't always think about the wording of the Torah. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you. On the 10th day of the 7th month you must afflict yourselves and not do any work, whether native-born or a foreigner residing among you. In the Hebrew it's ha'ezrach ha'hager. Because on this day atonement will be made for you to cleanse you. Then before the Lord you will be clean from all your sins. If you went to Shul in Yom Kippur this year, just a couple weeks ago. So the line we repeat in the liturgy a number of times. But either way, everyone has to observe Yom Kippur. Native born, the word in Hebrew is ezrach, which in modern Hebrew means a citizen, actually. The word means citizen. In biblical Hebrew it means native born. And foreigner. So it's talking about in the land of Israel. Now, how do you know from this verse that every Jew has to observe Yom Kippur?
That's
What?
the Ezra, right?
What?
Ezra
Is the word here? Yeah, exactly.
yeah, it's used in modern Hebrew too, right?
That's citizen, right? In modern Hebrew it means citizen.
An Israeli citizen.
Yeah, exactly. Like a citizen of Israel. Or any country. And Ezra means a citizen. And in the Torah really means more native born of the land. Which is the similar idea. But anyway, how do you know that every Jew has to observe Yom Kippur? Here it just says someone born in Israel has to observe it. Any native born, any Ezra, any citizen of Israel. How do you know that Jews who live all over the world have to observe Yom Kippur? So, I'll tell you something which may blow your mind. The Torah and the oral law and the tradition assumes that all Jews have the abstract status of native born of Israel. Think about it. Right? That's what's being said here. A Jew is equivalent to a citizen of Israel. we're getting a little bit tangential here. You'll see where I'm going to take it kind of full circle. And you have the next, also in Vayikra, it talks about Sukkot, similar language is used. Every native shall dwell in Sukkot. So you have this casual assumption in the Torah that all Jews are a part of Israel in some way, native born. As Ramth, if we use the term citizen, all Jews are connected eternally to the land of Israel, even if you're not born there. So that's just to kind of be provocative. Now, how do you know that we're supposed to be loyal to the lands we live in if we're always just have this mindset that we are native of Israel? Remember, in that verse, you can tell me if you see it differently, but Jew is considered equivalent. There's an equation being made between Jew and Ezra Haaretz, citizen of the land, so to speak. So here we have the primary source for the Jew's obligation to be productive and see themselves as part of the society in which they live in. And this is from Jeremiah, from Yirmiyahu, chapter 29, and I titled this Jewish Civic Responsibility in Exile, verse 4. Source number 4. And I would argue in terms of, let's say, people talk about dual loyalty. Maybe we do have dual loyalty. I think everyone has multiple layers of loyalty in their life. You have loyalty to your family, right? America's not fascist. It demands single loyalty. You have loyalty to your wife, your husband, your child, and your country. They're all very separate things. To your religion. America happens to allow dual citizenship, right? That's what I would always counter to people when they say, if you're dual loyal, I'm a dual citizen of Canada and America. Nobody ever accuses you of being nefarious, like, how do you like Canada and America at the same time? It's only Israel where that's questioned. So, but either way, so we see that a Jew is supposed to always be eternally loyal to the land of Israel, which is true, and loyal to the place in which they live, which we'll see from this source. And what I want to ask you, a very interesting question. Remember, we made a distinction between a pragmatic basis of voting, meaning is it just in Jewish interests, versus a principled basis, which was, do we view ourselves as a part of society? And I want us to analyze this source in Yirmiyah and see if it reflects a pragmatic basis of being part of the society you live in or a principled one. So, does anyone want to read any chance? Any volunteers? Okay, take it away.
Jeremiah 29.
This is
This
what.
book of the Lord Almighty, God of Israel, says, to all those whom I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and reap what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons, give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. And seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for in its prosperity you will prosper.
Okay, classic verse. And in here, you don't have the Hebrew in front of you, but the word for prosperity in the original, in the Torah, in the pasuk in Navi here is shalom, which sometimes means peace. It's one of those very words that has a lot of layers of meaning. It means hello and goodbye, right? It means peace. It means prosperity. That's how it's properly translated. I think, pray to the Lord. Ki bishlomo yashlamcha, basically. For in its, doesn't mean it's peace. It means, in that context, it means prosperity. For in its prosperity will be your prosperity. In other words, to give you the historical context, the prophet Yirmiyahu, who witnessed the destruction and the exile of the Jews after the destruction of the first temple, is speaking to those. There were a couple of different waves of exile. There were those who were exiled with King Yechoniah originally, and then a few years later, 13 years later, I think, King Sidkiyahu was exiled with almost all the rest of the Jews. There were stages. But either way, he's speaking to the first wave of exile, exiled with Yechoniah. We mentioned in the Megillah, Mordechai was descended, his great-grandfather seemingly had been exiled with, or him, depending on how you read it, I'm getting tangential, I'm sorry, with King Yechoniah, and they're going to stay in Babylon. Jeremiah had a tradition for 70 years. This exile is going to last for 70 years. How you calculate the 70 years is also a very big question. And he's telling them, there are all these false prophets telling them, don't settle down in Babylon. You're going back to Israel tomorrow. Don't worry, God's going to, false prophets were preaching this to the people. You're not really Babylonian. This is the context to understand it in. Don't even build homes there. You're there temporarily. You're about to return to Israel. Yirmiyahu says, do not listen to the false prophets. You're staying in Babylon for a while, and God wants you to stay there. And while you're there, you have to make the best of it and get married and settle down and be part of society and build homes. And pray for the peace of the place where you are. This is the source for the common custom in many synagogues, including my own, to say a prayer for the government. It's sourced in this very verse. Because Jeremiah commands the people, pray for the peace of the place in which you live while you are in exile before you return to Israel. So I would ask you, why, and it's very tricky, why do you have to pray for the peace of the place where you are? Is it pragmatic or is it principle? So what do you think? Based on the words. No right answer necessarily, but yeah.
It's not really an answer to your question.
Okay,
but
yeah.
It's sort of it. Well, it seems like it's on principle, but it also seems to have like a goal in mind, and that was to get the Jews to Babylon and not be in Israel anymore. But what I find most interesting is that Yirmiyahu is the source for this, because Yirmiyahu is known as like, it's been taken as like the anti-Zionist type of like Navi, whereas like Israel is not where it's at. Like you have to acquiesce, don't fight against the foreign power. You
Right.
belong in Israel.
And remember
you
the
belong
context, it
in
was actually
exile.
false prophets who
Right.
were preaching you're about to go back to Israel. And
Right.
he's saying this
Right,
in
and
the
Yirmiyahu is
context
the one
of
that says, no, you have to
disproving
take
that.
the yoke of like, so it's interesting,
Yeah.
like I think it's interesting to note that Yirmiyahu is telling the people that even though it's kind of against, it seems like it's against the interests of the Jews, and definitely the Jews in Israel, to be on the side of the Babylonians. That's what God wants for you. Like I feel like
Right.
it's a very kind of extreme example.
Okay, so you're saying this can't
I'm
necessarily be used as
being-
a source?
I
Because
don't
there's
know,
a
it's a
specific
question if it can
context.
be. I don't know if it, what I'm
Right.
saying, if it is, it pushes it really far in one direction. It's like
Wait,
wherever
which
you're
direction?
living,
You're saying just
wherever
settle.
you're living, that's where your loyalties lie.
Okay,
So
right,
it's like,
yeah,
to push
Especially
it.
in the Vina, sort of like,
right. We have a principle, the law of the land is the law, right?
I think this concept also has been difficult in Jewish history, that the fact that we're kind of roaming around, we don't have our own country, and a lot of sort of anti-Jewish or anti-Semitism depending on history causes that a lot, that we're not really like settled where we are. We don't have our own government, where we've been until very recently. So this is like, I'm just saying in terms of what we're discussing, this a lot of times has carried the faith of the Jewish people often, how much, where they are, and how much a part of what they're doing. And I think what's happening now in America is we've had more sway in what goes on than many other times in Jewish history almost.
Yeah,
So there's a context here that's larger than, you know, I think we're not
right,
thinking of. So.
right. Well, remember, by the way, Yirmiyahu also prophesies many places you're going to return to Israel eventually, so,
Right.
but, yeah,
Well, I think also within the verse where we have that God carried the people into exile. So
Right.
it's somewhat, part of submitting to God's will
so
as
he
well.
says, to all those whom I carried into exile, I
Right.
brought you, right,
So God took us there, have faith in God and where we are,
right,
potentially with then the hope of returning to Israel.
right,
But essentially like listening to God as opposed to rebelling.
right,
This is the
exactly.
reality.
So it's also an aspect of just faith in God. I brought you here, you're supposed to be here. Yeah,
In that same vein, religious observance doesn't end outside once you leave Israel, even
Right.
though Israel is the Jewish state, and many cities and locations in Israel have tremendous significance in Judaism.
right,
Once you leave, it's not like all is gone and
right.
forlorn.
He's also
There's
telling
still
them,
value in prayer.
Right.
There's still value in asking for what you need.
right,
And so that says I do think it's somewhat pragmatic. That once you leave Israel, you need to succeed,
right,
and if you have full faith in God, it makes sense that you should pray.
right. Exactly. There's still Jewish life outside of Israel. I was going to say something about that. Anyway, right. So so you're saying it's pragmatic in the sense of like it's just in your own interest.
But it's also that it's not a one-man show. Again, it's really about a greater picture. My success is dependent on a lot of things working out in the right way,
Right.
and that's also dependent on the government functioning properly. That I feel safe. That I have the proper
Exactly.
resources and I know how to access these resources so I can actually succeed.
Right. I was going to say in pagan religions at the time, it was seen that the god was local. So if you get exiled from your land, you have to adopt the new local god because your god only has dominion in your land. Right. This is a classic theme of monotheism here. Like actually, God controls the whole world. I mean, He's more present perhaps in the land of Israel, but He created the whole universe. It's a universal idea that's specific to monotheism. Yeah.
I also wanted to add that, we're supposed to increase, not decrease. So maybe there's an idea of being leaders, being Jews outside of the rest of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and having a presence.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, maybe you'll be potentially, like a messianic way, I don't know.
Right. Maybe